What's up, biology students? Mr. Holloway here with another video for you about human anatomy and physiology. And the topic of today's video is going to be the immune system. Now, the immune system is the system that protects us from disease, and it plays a very important role in helping us to maintain homeostasis because it is the thing that is protecting our body against foreign invaders that might do us harm and make us sick. There are several different kinds of pathogens which we are probably familiar with. There's bacteria, single-celled organisms without a nucleus that cause us to get sick with things like strep throat or food poisoning or tetanus or pneumonia. Viruses, which are non-living particles, they do contain genetic material, and they use the cell's equipment and their own genetic material to help them reproduce and spread themselves around. But these viruses have a big effect on us. They cause things like the common cold, flu, a variety of sexually transmitted diseases, as well as some really nasty things like measles and smallpox. And we've also got fungi, and fungal infections can cause things like ringworm, athlete's foot, and fungi can straight up make you sick too because they contain toxic compounds, which is why it's important not to eat mushrooms that you find growing in the forest. And then there are also protozoa, single-celled organisms with a nucleus that can cause sickness like malaria or giardia. And a lot of these pathogens are carried around by vectors. And a vector is anything that spreads a pathogen from one organism to another. And those include some organisms that we're pretty familiar with, things like mosquitoes, ticks, mice, and even bats. Mosquitoes, for example, in some parts of the world they carry malaria. Ticks carry things like Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Mice can transmit things like the hantavirus to us, and bats can transmit things like rabies, which is why it's particularly important never to approach a bat that you see out during the day. If it's out during the day, there's a pretty good chance that it's sick, and you certainly don't want it to bite you and give you rabies. Our first line of defense includes things like barriers and body fluids. The skin, first and foremost, keeps things out. And should things get through some opening in our body, bodily fluids like saliva, mucus, and tears will be produced to try to push those things back out of our body. As anybody with severe allergies knows, sometimes these bodily fluids can be quite annoying, but they are there to try to push pathogens back out of our body and get rid of them. Should something break through our first line of defenses, our body has a second line of defense that includes things like the histamine response, fevers, and these proteins called interferons. And so once these pathogens get through our first line of defense and into our body uses these three categories of defenses to try to eliminate the threat before it goes any further. And both our first and second line of defense are non-specific, meaning that they don't target any specific pathogens, they just try to keep us safe from as many things as they can. Our third line of defense is what we call the immune response. And the immune response is called a specific response because the cells that our immune system uses are specific to a certain type of invading pathogen. Beginning with our first line of defense, let's start with an example many people are pretty familiar with. So let's say that you were to inhale one of these particles through your nose. And one of these particles that we see here in this picture is a pollen grain. When we breathe these things into our respiratory tract, our body starts producing a variety of fluids to try to push them back out. And we get a stuffy nose and all this mucus buildup in our sinuses that's meant to push these pollen grains, or whatever it is that got inside of us, back out of us again, and sometimes quite violently, as in the case of a sneeze, which is where we're trying to expel something from the body that shouldn't be there. Should something get through our first line of defense, it might encounter one of the factors involved in our second line of defense. So say, for example, you get a splinter. And a splinter breaks through your skin, breaks through the barrier that was meant to protect you, and it introduces a little bit of bacteria underneath your skin. And that bacteria could potentially cause an infection. And your body responds to that by releasing these compounds called histamines. The downside of them is that they make us pretty itchy, and we might take something like Benadryl, which is an antihistamine, to try to get rid of those things and make the itchiness go away. But the reason those histamines are being released into our body in the first place is to help us fight something off, although every now and then they get triggered accidentally and cause an allergic reaction that we would rather not have. But what those histamines do is they stimulate increased blood flow to that area by causing the capillaries in that area to dilate or get wider. And that brings a whole bunch of new white blood cells to the area. And white blood cells are a key component of our immune system. So those white blood cells will move into our tissues and start literally engulfing and destroying the bacteria that was introduced when we got that splinter. And at that point, then the histamines break down and go away, and hopefully the itchiness is over, and hopefully those white blood cells got rid of whatever got under your skin and was going to give you an infection otherwise. Our body might also develop a fever to try to fight things off. And a fever actually is a symptom of illness, but it's something our body is doing to try to keep us safe and keep us healthy. A fever is also our body's natural reaction to something invading us, so there's considerable debate over what's the best thing to do with a fever. Do you let it run its course and do its job, or do you try to bring that fever down so that you can be comfortable? It's a pretty good question. Our body also uses these proteins called interferons as part of our second line of defense, and interferons are proteins that inhibit the expression of foreign DNA. So when our body recognizes that we've got some foreign DNA, either from a bacteria or from a virus, these interferons are supposed to inhibit its expression. And hopefully that will shut down that foreign DNA from being able to do anything, like produce more viruses, for example, and ultimately, hopefully, will clear us of that particular pathogen. And our third line of defense, or our specific immune response, is based on a whole bunch of different kinds of cells. Most of them are things that we would call white blood cells. And in particular, we have these white blood cells known as B cells and T cells. Those B cells seem to have these funny little Y-shaped things sticking out of them. Those funny little Y-shaped things are really important proteins called antibodies, yet another of the many important roles that proteins do inside of our bodies. And these antibodies have a very, very specific shape about them, which is why the immune response is called a specific defense rather than a non-specific defense, because these antibodies will only bind to specific things. And anything that binds to an antibody is called an antigen. And that antigen might be contained on a bacteria, it might be contained on a virus, it might be contained on a protozoa, but in any case, this antigen, if it binds with an antibody, that tells our body, hey, we've got something here. We've got some non-self material, something that doesn't belong to us, and we need to get rid of it. This part of our immune system, the humoral immunity, takes place in our bodily fluids like our blood and our lymph. And the primary weapon used by our humoral immunity are antibodies. Antibodies bind to specific antigens, and what that does is it stimulates this B cell to produce a bunch more cells. Some of them are called plasma cells, and these plasma cells produce more of this particular antibody so that we can hopefully pick up and target and destroy a whole bunch more of these antigens, should any be present in our system. And it also stimulates our body to produce these things called memory B cells. And memory B cells hang around for a while after an infection, so that if we should reinfect ourselves, our immune system is already primed to take care of it because these memory B cells are ready and waiting. And by binding to an antigen in this way, our humoral immune system prevents these antigens, things like bacteria and viruses, all those pathogens we just talked about, it prevents them from being able to enter our cells. And if we can prevent them from entering our cells, hopefully we can just get rid of them and pass them out with our bodily fluids or break them down in some other way. Our cell-mediated immunity is a response to pathogens that actually do invade our cells, and the primary weapons are white blood cells called macrophages and these other white blood cells called T cells. Let's say a macrophage, a white blood cell, encounters a pathogen, something that shouldn't be inside of your body. That white blood cell is going to engulf that pathogen, kind of like surround it and almost eat it. You could think of it sort of like that. These cells called T cells then will recognize that, and they will bind to this activated macrophage because they recognize those antigens on the surface of it there. And that's going to stimulate the production of some other T cells called helper T cells and killer T cells. And these killer T cells are also known as cytotoxic T cells. And those cytotoxic T cells, they target this macrophage and they break it down along with all of the bad stuff that was contained inside of that macrophage. So our macrophage, our white blood cell, kind of acts as a temporary prison for this pathogen until this cytotoxic T cell can come along and literally destroy not only the pathogen but the entire prison that it is contained in. We also have a bit of immune system memory that helps us from getting reinfected. So in both cases, whether we're talking about our humoral immunity, which takes place in our bodily fluids, or our cell-mediated immunity, which takes place inside of our cells, in both cases, these memory cells are going to be produced. And those memory cells sort of hang out for a while, and they prevent us from getting reinfected. So that should we be exposed to that same pathogen again, our bodies are already ready for it. They've already got a whole bunch of soldiers, a whole bunch of white blood cells ready and waiting, so that if a second batch of that pathogen makes it into our system, we've got the cells ready to take it out. And that immune system memory can be thought of as what we call active immunity. Now let's back up just a second, because there's a bunch of things about us that contribute to our resistance to disease. And some of those include just our innate genetic abilities. Some of us are more or less sensitive to pathogens just simply based on our genetics. But a lot of our immunity is also acquired. And of that immunity that can be acquired, we have passive immunity and active immunity. And our passive immunity can come from a couple of different sources. The first of which happens as we are developing inside of our mother's womb and as we are being born. And as we are developing in utero, our mothers are passing us antibodies by way of the placenta. And those antibodies help get our immune system ready for the things that our body is likely to face once it's born and once we make our way out into the world. In some cases, we can also artificially introduce these antibodies into a person, say through a serum or something like that, if they should have a damaged immune system that we need to repair using medicine. Active immunity, on the other hand, uses our own antibodies, and that can be acquired through a couple of ways as well. So, it can be acquired naturally. If we are exposed to something and our body creates a bunch of antibodies to fight it in the future and creates a bunch of those memory cells to help us prevent reinfection, that's a kind of active immunity. Our body is taking an active role in preventing future infection by making a whole bunch of defenses against future infection. But it can also happen artificially through immunization. And immunization, that's the same thing as vaccination. We can take a variety of shots that prime our immune system against potentially harmful pathogens that we may encounter and that may make us very, very, very sick if those things were to get inside of our body. And we don't want to take the chance that we might not be able to develop a natural immunity to these things, because sometimes some of these things that we immunize for are things that could kill us the first time we get them, in which case our body doesn't have time to develop its own immunity to them. So we vaccinate and we prevent ourselves from getting sick from a variety of things by doing that. We can also fight disease using a bunch of, well, our human technology. We can use antibiotics, we can use these things called vaccines, and we can use proper sanitation to protect us from disease. So things like antibiotics are meant to target biotic organisms, things like bacteria and things like protozoa and things like fungi that might invade our body and make us sick. Vaccines are basically meant to prime our immune system for something really bad that if we were exposed to it, we might not be ready for. And what a vaccine does is it introduces generally a dead strain of a particular disease to your system, dead so that it can't actually harm you. But your body still recognizes it as being foreign, so it produces a whole bunch of antibodies getting ready to be potentially reinfected. So if we give ourselves something like a flu vaccine, our body produces a whole bunch of antibodies to get ready for more flu viruses, so that should a flu virus invade our system, we are ready for it, and we will take it out quickly, and we hopefully won't get sick. Now, some of these vaccines last a lifetime. Others of them, like the flu vaccine, we need to get every year. But vaccines have been very important in advancing our society and getting rid of a whole bunch of pretty terrible diseases. And since we discovered that disease was caused by microorganisms, which is a really important theory that we call the germ theory of disease, we've invented vaccines to protect us against measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis, the human papilloma virus, or HPV, which is associated with cervical cancer, polio, diphtheria, meningitis, yellow fever, typhoid, smallpox, tetanus, rabies, pertussis, influenza, tuberculosis, anthrax, shingles, and many more vaccines are currently in the work for other diseases that we don't have vaccines for. So vaccines are very important, and they've virtually eliminated a lot of these diseases from our society so that virtually nobody gets them anymore, and we don't have to deal with the terrible symptoms of something like measles or smallpox. We can also prevent ourselves from getting sick using sanitation, washing our hands after we go to the bathroom, or washing our hands after we handle raw meat. And then we can also clean our food, make sure we keep it refrigerated, make sure we cook it thoroughly, make sure we don't use the same knife that we used to cut that raw chicken to then cut some vegetables, because then we might be spreading bacteria from raw meat to these vegetables. And basically all of these things can help keep us safe and help keep us from spreading disease from one person to another as well. Now, obviously, the immune system plays a very important role in helping us to maintain homeostasis, because any of these pathogens can really throw off our internal environment and completely throw us out of balance. Some of them can even kill us. So our immune system helps protect us from that and helps us to get rid of things that are going to throw our internal environment into disarray. All right, that's it for our video today. Feel free to go back and watch this video as many times as you need to make sure you understand the concepts and picked up on all of the important vocabulary. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk a little bit more about this stuff the next time I see you in class.